County Library System welcomes you to our monthly series from the Historic Reno Preservation Society. Tonight's topic is Suffrage, Women's Rights, and Historic Preservation in Nevada. My name is Samantha, and I'm so happy to be here with you tonight. And now I would like to introduce Carol Coleman with the Historic Reno Preservation Society. Again, welcome and thank you.
Thanks, Samantha. I'm Carol Coleman, and I'm president of Historic Reno Preservation Society. We're a nonprofit whose mission is to preserve and promote historic resources in the Truckee Meadows. We fulfill that mission through education, like this program today, and through advocacy. I'm pleased now to introduce the co-chairs of our speaker programs, Sherry Hayes Zorn and Susan Mullen. They'll tell you about the speaker and tonight's program and thank them for all the work they do. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Susan Mullen. Welcome to Suffrage, Women's Rights, and Historic Preservation in Nevada. Last year, the Nevada State Historic Preservation Office received a federal grant through the National Park Service to create a historic context for women's history in Nevada, with the goal of identifying places and properties associated with women's history and the suffrage movement in our state. ZoAnn and Alicia are the project coordinators for that, and tonight they'll discuss how they went about writing the context and how it can be put to use. ZoAnn is an architectural historian and historic preservation consultant with Couts Environmental Consultants of Reno. Alicia is a writer and historian who specializes in the cultural history and landscapes of Nevada and the American West. Please welcome ZoAnn and Alicia.
Thank you so much, Susan. And thank you for the introduction. So as Susan mentioned, this Women's History Project was funded by a federal grant through the National Park Service. The specific program funding, this context is the Underrepresented Community Grants Program, and that works towards diversifying the nominations that are submitted to the National Register of Historic Places. Since 2014, the National Park Service has awarded almost $4 million in grants through this program. And those grant-supported projects include surveys and inventories of historic properties that are associated with communities underrepresented in the National Register, and also the development of nominations to the National Register for specific sites. We received this contract in the summer of 2020, and we'll be wrapping up the final product in November. So we're in the late stages of it, but we're not quite finished with it yet. So just to give you an idea of the project scope, the end product will be a document that includes a broad historical overview of women's history in Nevada, but not the entire history. We couldn't possibly discuss everything women have done in the state. So SHPO made the decision that the context should focus on places and properties associated specifically with women's rights and with the suffrage movement in Nevada. So we spend a lot of time discussing the campaign for women's suffrage that was underway by the time of Nevada statehood and culminated in the ratification of the 19th Amendment in 1920. And we do this with the knowledge that that amendment only guaranteed suffrage to white women. So we've also been investigating historical efforts to extend suffrage to all women, regardless of race, both before and after its passage. And finally, we discuss women's rights, which we define as efforts to improve the lives of women and children in Nevada up through 1980. Stopping at that point, approximately 50 years ago, ensures that any historical resources that are identified would qualify for the National Register. And it kind of gives about a decade of buffer. Since with a few exceptions, resources do have to be 50 years old to qualify. But it does give the report a nice shelf life by taking that time frame through 1980.
Hi, everyone. I'm Alicia Barber, and just to pick up on what ZoAnn has been saying, we have another important goal of the context, which is to identify as many as we can specific historic properties that are associated with this history and with these themes. So the purpose of combining a historical narrative, which is really kind of the most substantial part of the context, with the identification of relevant properties, is to provide a framework for nominating properties to the National Register of Historic Places that are associated with significant suffrage and women's rights activities in the state of Nevada. So the document itself doesn't do that, doesn't actually nominate any of these properties to the National Register, but it really helps pave the way for that to happen in the future. And that is a really important contribution that it can make, because if people are familiar with any of the nominations to the National Register of Historic Places, they're just incredibly rich documents, particularly more recently. They weren't originally actually quite as substantive as they are today when they first introduced the program. But they have to include the background and the significance of a site and place it in context. So if we have already done this broader context for the state, which also refers to national movements, the national context, we can help give that a boost. And then the nominations themselves can be written by almost anyone, as long as they are working in coordination with the State Historic Preservation Office, the SHPO. So the context, when it's done, will be a public document that can be used by anyone. It will be on the State Historic Preservation Office website, and we're going to show you what that page looks like, because there are some other resources on there now. It can be used then for anyone who wants to nominate properties to local historic registers as well, state historic registers, or to help provide context for other things like historical markers or other interpretive historical projects, which is the kind of stuff that I work on all the time, exhibits and anything, sort of temporary, but they're just a really rich resource. So the project also includes another additional task, which is to compile some documentation regarding the women's suffrage movement and other significant women's history that occurred in the Nevada state capitol or on Capitol grounds. And the specific task that we have here is to make recommendations for whether the existing National Register listing for the state capitol should be amended to include new areas and or periods of significance that are pertaining to women's history. The state capitol was listed in the National Register of Historic Places in 1974. So very early in that process, when, like I said, they were really pretty bare bones as far as these nomination forms are concerned. And often they are very much about the physical structure, sometimes the architecture, occasionally the architect, but they didn't really have as much of this sort of substantive historical narrative. And so when they're written now, they have to have all of that. So the images here are some of the more familiar images, I think, of women associated with the state capitol. We have Hannah Clapp on the bottom in the Capitol fence. As many know, Clapp and her partner, Eliza Babcock, won the commission to supply the materials for construction of the new Capitol fence in 1875. It was part of a new landscaping initiative. And they acquired the wrought iron from a Philadelphia firm and had it shipped to Carson City and got a tidy little profit for that. The other image there is Sadie Hurst, who was Nevada's first female legislator, who is standing next to Governor Emmett Boyle as he signs the resolution to ratify the 19th Amendment in 1920. She was elected to the Nevada Assembly in Washoe County in 1918. So, but we're thinking also beyond these more well-known stories, although they are also not in that National Register nomination, to consider all women with a connection to the Capitol, legislators and staff and events, speeches, incidents that were occurring there. So we know, for instance, that we have learned that the state legislature approved the installation of the first women's toilet in the building in 1899. So that's one of the pieces that we're sort of filing away as information that we've gleaned about the Capitol, the Nevada state Capitol. And we will determine by the end if we think that all of this warrants amending that nomination with respect to these themes.
Okay, so the context report itself is divided into 5 general time periods. And we just kind of wanted to give you a sense of what those are. We start with pre-territory Nevada up to 1861. Then we go into the territorial and early statehood years of 1861 to 1889, the Progressive Era from 1890 to 1914, women's civic and government involvement from 1915 to 1945, and then the post-war period from 1946 to 1980. As you can imagine, we cover a lot of ground within each of these eras. Especially considering that we're looking at events that happened across the entire state. And also, as Alicia mentioned, we're like looping those back into what was happening nationally at the time. So without going into too much detail, we do want to just briefly review the general topics that we cover for each time period before we dive into kind of what this means for Reno. So our first section is a very high-level overview of the history of Nevada before it became a territory of the United States. So we briefly cover the indigenous peoples of the region, including the Mojave, the Northern Paiute, the Southern Paiute, the Washoe, and the Western Shoshone tribes. We also mention explorers, immigrant parties, and early settlers, including the Latter-day Saints, which, were kind of the first white people to establish permanent settlements in Nevada. And then we introduce the major impetus for migration to Nevada, which was, of course, the discovery of the Comstock Lode in Virginia City.
I'll just pick it up a little bit here. So then we discussed some aspects of women's lives from the time that Nevada Territory was established in 1861 into the first 25 years of statehood from 1864 to 1889. And during this time, Nevada's population was disproportionately male as a result in large part of the main occupations that were being pursued at the time and pursuits. And even by 1880, women only made up 32.5% of the state's population. So we talk a lot about women's legal status during this time and their rights during the period, which could be best described as limited, although they did have some rights when it came to divorce and property. And this is a really interesting theme that we really have seen continuing throughout Nevada's history in terms of having kind of control over marital status, which of course became a pretty big business a little bit later on in Nevada's history with the migratory divorce trade. Women did have control over their marital status with divorce laws that allowed women to file for divorce under certain circumstances, more grounds for divorce than in practically any other state. On the grounds of, you had to sue on the grounds of a specific thing, right? Before there was no fault divorce. So adultery, desertion, felony conviction, endangerment of the woman's life, drunkenness, right? A whole variety of things. And women did have some property rights at this time. They could establish a homestead. They could make a will. They could create prenuptial agreements to protect their personal property from becoming community property. And so this was something that was a little more common out in the American West than back east. And we found some just great kernels of anecdotes and information and legal information. And one thing I want to mention is that we have not entered into this alone as researchers. So we actually have formed an advisory group where we have been consulting with leading scholars of women's history in Nevada throughout, and also organizations that themselves are devoted to chronicling, documenting, researching, promoting, and interpreting women's history in the state. And so one of our advisors is Dr. Dana Bennett, who, with her help, we discovered a statute that passed in 1877 that read, this is 1877, any male person in this state who is more than 18 years of age, who shall willfully and violently strike, beat, or torture the body of any maiden or woman who is more than 16 years of age, with a misdemeanor. And if convicted, they were to be sentenced, and this is the language, to be firmly tied or lashed to a substantial wooden post or stone pillar to be erected by each county in a public space and remain there for 2 to 10 hours, that was up to the judge, with a placard reading "woman beater" or "wife beater" as the case may be. And conviction for a second offense carried a sentence of 30 days to 6 months in county jail. So we actually found some stories of a handful of men who were actually subjected to this. And it's a little bit unclear now whether that law, that statute, was ever repealed or if it actually remains something that is on the books today. So among aspects like that, about things that were impacting the welfare of women, we also talk about some of the roles that women played in early Nevada. Many were educators. That was one of the first professions that women held in the state. Other women owned businesses, and on the Comstock, that actually was a pretty prominent thing to do, from restaurants, millinery, clothing stores. Others worked as seamstresses and domestics. And their opportunities were obviously very much constrained by their economic background and also their ethnic heritage. Native American women had many fewer opportunities, especially on the Comstock, not to be, inhabiting the traditional Euro-American occupations. And so we really want to look at that. We're trying to pay a lot of attention to the great diversity of the experience of women in the state. But women really did make an indelible impression on education in the state at this time. Hannah Clapp is pictured here with a group of students, well known for establishing schools in Carson City and Reno, lobbying for education legislation and funding. Sarah Winnemucca also established a school in Lovelock for Paiute children in the 1880s. When the University of Nevada moved to Reno in 1885, many women were enrolled there, and many women started teaching there from an early point. In 1889, the Nevada State Constitution was amended to allow women to run for election as school superintendents and school trustees, and that preceded when they could actually run for legislature and other sort of higher state offices, but education was sort of the way they got in there. So we also in this period mentioned ladies' auxiliaries and other social aid endeavors, especially on the Comstock, which were established as women started to move into civic life, and it began to be more acceptable to do that through kind of the window of the domestic sphere, or different types of occupations or activities that were more associated with what was considered women's accepted and traditional role. So that transition also bolstered the temperance movement. Temperance organizations existed in Nevada since the territorial period, but that movement finally gained steam when the Women's Christian Temperance Union, or WCTU, was formed in the 1870s. Reno established a local branch in 1882 and channeled their members' energy into political and social reforms. And that's really where we see a lot of this early association with the suffrage movement, with other kind of reforms that got women out into the public sphere. So some suffrage activism starts to appear in this period of time, in this early statehood era. Touring speakers, including Laura DeForest Gordon, traveled through the state to speak about suffrage. The first state suffrage amendment passed in 1869, with a lot of support from citizens of rural northern Nevada. And the state's first suffrage convention was held in Battle Mountain in 1870. But based on Nevada law, of course, and this is true today, all amendments to the Nevada Constitution have to be passed at 2 successive meetings of the legislature. So the bill that was passed in 1869 failed in 1871. But we got very close to having women's suffrage at a very, very early time. Legislators did introduce some suffrage amendments and legislation in the 1870s and the 1880s, but none of them were successful. And one passed in the Senate, but not the Assembly in 1883. 1887, they both passed their own legislation, but they couldn't come to a workable compromise about what it would say. Another one failed in 1889. So it would be some time before Nevada actually allowed its women to vote. And that brings us to the Progressive Era, where we see a whole proliferation of women's clubs in the state, including the 20th Century Club in Reno, and later Elko, the Mesquite Club in Las Vegas, the Goldfield Women's Club, and many of the women in these clubs would become really instrumental in the suffrage movement in the 1910s. These clubs were often dedicated to social reform, although they might not have used that terminology, but with a specific aim of improving the lives of women and children. So we really have compiled a lot of information about these clubs, which really were throughout the state. And we see women of this era actively lobbying the legislature for these reforms. In the 1890s, the suffrage movement shifted from Battle Mountain to Austin and Reno. And the 1896 legislature passed a suffrage bill And a whole flurry of speaking engagements and dances took place throughout Nevada over the next few years to drum up support for a second favorable vote. But during the 1897 session, passed in the Senate, failed in the Assembly. It was kind of a common pattern at this point. By 1911, the suffrage movement in Nevada was really intensifying with the establishment of the Nevada Equal Franchise Society in Reno, the NEFS. And an organized, very concentrated effort was made to support and pass yet another suffrage amendment in the legislature that year, and it passed, and that's 1911. So a number of these Nevada Equal Franchise Society county leagues formed throughout the whole state. And from there, we see a bunch of pro-suffrage talks and events that bring in national and local speakers. And you just see them coming in all the time from across the country. They're really traversing all of the states on these speaking tours to try to generate support for suffrage throughout the American West. So the campaign was successful. The 1913 legislature passed the bill a second time, despite the emergence of a handful of very vocal anti-suffrage organizations, and those included both men and women. The amendment then was scheduled for the 1914 general ballot, so the people would then vote. And that set off another whirlwind of organized campaigning over the next year. It passed. And so Nevada women who were recognized as citizens were given the vote at that time.
So once female citizens win the right to vote in Nevada, they start to focus their efforts on securing national suffrage because they can vote in Nevada, but they can't vote in any national elections. And so the Nevada Equal Franchise Society is reorganized into the Women's Civic League. A Women's Citizens Club is formed. And we also see local branches of the National Women's Party being established throughout the state. When US Congress passes the 19th Amendment, guaranteeing women of America the right to vote in 1919, the amendment sent out to the states for ratification, and Nevada ratified it on February 7th, 1920. And so this was a huge win, but it is important to note that the 19th Amendment did not guarantee all women access to the polls. Although it did prevent voter discrimination on the basis of sex, it did not protect against other discriminating barriers put forth by states, like requiring a poll tax or a literacy test or some kind of moral character evaluation. So women who maybe lost their citizenship by marrying a man who was not a citizen, they were also denied the right to vote. And so were women who belonged to immigrant groups for whom naturalization was banned. Native American women were also denied citizenship and therefore excluded from voting until 1924, when the Snyder Act passed. And the Snyder Act gave citizenship to Native Americans. During this time, we also see women forging political careers, winning offices, first with the Nevada Board of Regents and with school districts, also county clerkships. And then in 1918, Sadie Hurst becomes the first woman elected to the state assembly in 1918. And if you'll remember that picture of the Governor Boyle signing the 19th Amendment, she is the one who is pictured right beside him. So women now have the right to vote everywhere. And so some women's clubs start to wane because instead of focusing their political energies towards, winning the vote and finally becoming enfranchised, women are now joining political parties and joining groups like the League of Women Voters. But we do see clubs like, especially the 20th Century Club and the Mesquite Club, still going strong. And we also see new groups emerge like the Business and Professional Women's Federation. And then of course, World War II has a major, albeit temporary, impact for women in the workforce. We see a bunch of women entering the workforce, taking jobs of, the men who had to go fight in the war. and learning skills that they wouldn't have even had the opportunity to learn before, earning incomes outside of the home. But ultimately, when the war ends, many of them are forced to go back to the home. And that brings us to our last time period, which is the post-war era. And we have 2 slides for this because we just see a ton of developments related to women's rights in Nevada during this period. We see a complete restructuring of Nevada's educational system and the establishment of a state sales tax to fund education. And we also see an influx of female state legislators like Maud Fraser, Hazel Denton, Helen Hare, Jean Ford, and Sue Wagner. As second wave feminism gains traction, we see women's rights organizations joining forces with civil rights organizers, including a major push by the Nevada League of Women Voters for the integration of schools in Clark County. And welfare reform also becomes a major issue of this era. Nevada's welfare system was inherently broken and punitive. Nevada was the last state in the union to accept the Social Security Act's aid to dependent children. The Social Security Act came about in 1935. Nevada did not accept the ADC until 1955. And even though we were administering this program, the people who were running it did so really under the false assumption that all recipients of assistance were trying to cheat the system. So women who needed assistance in many cases were denied on very flimsy grounds. And those who did receive assistance were not provided enough to survive for themselves or their children. And so we start to see women activists, including Ruby Duncan, Alversa Beals, who's pictured here, and Maya Miller. And they are putting pressure on the legislature. They are staging protests, they are lobbying, and ultimately they made major strides in reforming Nevada's welfare policies. And also ultimately instituting the National Food Stamp Program in the state. We also start seeing a lot more women in the workforce in the 1960s and the 1970s. The Culinary Union in Las Vegas did a lot at this time to improve the lives of women and children by offering higher wages and benefits, more job security and dignity on the job, and decrease sex, age, and race-based discrimination. And then in 1964, Governor Grant Sawyer establishes the Nevada Commission on the Status of Women to examine conditions that created barriers for women, especially in the workplace. We also see the League of Women Voters becoming even more active in the state. They have offices in Northern Nevada and in Southern Nevada. And we see the formation of local chapters of the National Organization for Women. Reproductive rights become a huge issue for women of this era, and women's healthcare clinics like Planned Parenthood are established in Reno and Las Vegas, and they offer family planning services and access to birth control. And of course, after Roe v. Wade passes, the Nevada legislature amended the state's abortion law to align with the new law of the land. We also see the emergence of women's resource centers, including rape crisis centers, shelters, and other places offering supportive services for women. And then we have the Equal Rights Amendment, which the US Congress passed in 1971. The amendment was very straightforward. It stated that equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. So it basically just said that men and women were equal under the law. Even though this seems really straightforward, it proved to be very controversial. It got very political. It was sent to the states for ratification, but the Nevada state legislature failed to ratify it during multiple sessions in the 70s and 80s. Despite this, the state legislature of the 70s did pass a lot of successful legislation that rectified discriminatory language that had been on the books. So they did make a lot of progress. And we wrap up this section by discussing the Nevada Women's Conference, which was held in Las Vegas in 1977 and featured Gloria Steinem as the keynote speaker. It was attended by 1,400 people. It was considered a success. And yeah, so that's basically a context in, I don't know, a nutshell. So we'll now kind of dive into how this relates to Reno's historic landscape. And we'll do that while keeping in mind that the major goal of this project is to identify properties that are important for their association with suffrage and women's rights throughout the whole state of Nevada. And that's a very broad topic. So we thought it could be helpful in this presentation to share with you some of the information we've researched and compiled about suffrage activities that took place specifically in Reno and their association with physical properties in the community, and also talk about how this work might be of some help as the community moves forward. So there are some historical resources related to these topics that remain standing, but unfortunately, there are also many that are gone. But even for those that are no longer here, we can broaden our understanding of them by making sure that their relationship to women's history is better recognized.
So we're just going to show some images of some of the places that have really had a relevance to the story that we're telling of women's rights and women's suffrage. Some of which, as ZoAnn said, are standing and some of which are long gone. And in that second category, we have the first one, which is the McCoy Opera House. This is one of the most early significant structures to the women's rights movement in Nevada, but specifically in Reno. This was located on the northeast corner of North Sierra and 3rd Streets, and it was the site of an early state convention. And so we actually saw sort of throughout the study that these conventions and these speeches and meetings would be held at a lot of various meeting houses and theaters that were really scattered throughout communities. And the Opera House was known for being a place that had all sorts of different types of performances, but also speeches and lectures throughout, because despite efforts at the late 1800s to guarantee women's suffrage in Nevada, the movement didn't get meaningful traction until the 1910s. And there were all of these different attempts to pass amendments, but they wouldn't get passed in the next legislative session. So after the suffrage amendment passed in the 1895 legislature, the National American Women's Suffrage Association, there are a lot of acronyms that are easy to get confused in this context, called for a mass meeting in Reno that October to form a Nevada State Suffrage Association. And so they held a state convention here at the McCoy Opera House, and they renamed their league the Nevada State Equal Suffrage Association in that meeting, and they adopted a constitution and officers. And what is so helpful is that not only have these stories really been documented by a lot of women who have preceded us and men telling the story of women's history in Nevada, but historical newspapers at the time were so detailed in the meetings that took place in different places and what officers were nominated and who was elected president and what actually took place at the meeting. So they're just wonderful. And now that, of course, historical newspapers are digitized largely, even in rural areas, we're able to access a lot of that hadn't been available before. So that's what they did. They had a state convention here, and events were held for the next 2 years to drum up support for the second vote on the amendment, including one in 1896, where Susan B. Anthony and Carrie Chapman Catt, who were national figures in suffrage, spoke at the Opera House here in Reno. But of course, that time, like many other times, the amendment failed to secure a second vote in the legislature in 1897. But the Opera House stayed there for many years. It kind of adapted through the years. It actually became a hotel. And so it kind of changed its appearance. And then we have, of course, the site today, which is the El Dorado Hotel Casino. So there is no more Opera House there. But it's really, I think, helpful for us to think about where these places were located. Of course, that was right on the north side of the railroad tracks, which was the centerpiece of Reno at the time. So having that proximity made it possible when you had a convention for people to very easily come and attend your event and your convention.
So when we're looking at the campaign for suffrage in Nevada, the leaders that emerge tend to be educated and relatively affluent white women. They were both married and unmarried, and a lot of them, although not all of them, were also employed outside the home. The slow but steady growth of the University of Nevada in Reno attracted and nurtured a number of these women who came to serve key roles both at the university and also in the suffrage movement. Two of the most prominent and influential are pictured here, Anne Martin and Jeannie Weir, who both taught in the history department at the University of Nevada. Jeannie Weir would establish the Nevada Historical Society in 1904. And she was an acquaintance of Catherine Mackey, who was the daughter-in-law of Comstock King John Mackey. And Catherine wrote Jeannie in 1909 from New York City and asked her whether a branch of the Equal Franchise Society could be started in Nevada. Weir responded positively. She thought that there was enough interest, they could start one. And so the effort to found a state branch of the Equal Franchise Society began. Central to its establishment was Felice Cohn. She is one of a few female attorneys who lent their professional expertise to Nevada's suffrage movement in the 1910s. And so the Nevada Equal Franchise Society was formally founded, and that establishment happened here at the Oddfellows Hall in Reno in January 1911. And this is a postcard of Oddfellows Hall. And this is what it looks like now. I'm sure you're all familiar with this building. I mean, it's right downtown on the corner of Center and 2nd Street. There was a fire in the 1940s that required the removal of the top 2 floors of the building, which is why it now looks like this. Getting back to the Nevada Equal Franchise Society, 2 members of the newly formed organization, Emma Mack and Felice Cohn, drafted a resolution that formed the basis of the legislation that they would introduce that February 1911 into the legislative session. And that resolution stated, there shall be no denial of the elective franchise at any election on account of sex. As the head of the Nevada Equal Franchise Society Committee, Felice Cohn was responsible not just for the basis of the legislation's language, but also for the strategy of conciliatory legislation that the group ended up adopting to gain support for it. The resolution was successful. It passed both houses of the legislature and was adopted just days before the session ended. Just speaking about Felice Cohn for a time, she lived at the Colonial Apartments on West Street. This is probably also a building you're all very familiar with. It's the corner of West and First. This is a photograph of it in 1907. You can see, I find this interesting. There's like a little house where what we now think of as the courtyard is. And then, of course, the Colonial Apartments today, it is now the Westland.
I love that picture when it had the little house right next to it. I just think about who was living in that little house with being surrounded by the apartments. So that's sort of an example about how we can see these intersections of different types of history we haven't necessarily thought about when looking at a specific building. We've known that the Colonial Apartments played a role in the migratory divorce trade because, of course, it was a very popular place for people who were here in Reno to get their divorce to stay during that period of time. But of course, people lived there too, and for longer periods of time. So another very important institution in Reno with a number of different buildings was the 20th Century Club, because back when they were organizing to try to secure that second favorable vote in 1913, so then the legislation could go to the state voters, a lot of leaders of local and state organizations really worked to urge their membership to promote suffrage and took leadership roles in the movement. And so one of those people was Florence Humphrey Church, who's pictured here. From 1912 to 1914, Church really tried to inspire the 20th Century Club, which had been originally organized in 1894, to be more politically active in the suffrage movement, as well as other movements. But for her specifically suffrage, despite the club's no politics provision and some active anti-suffrage members who vehemently opposed their efforts. So it was really a kind of tense time of conflict within that institution. She was elected vice president of the local WCTU, the Temperance Union, in 1911. At some point, she was the president of the Nevada Federation of Women's Clubs and president of the 20th Century Club. This is a very involved woman. The picture here is at the club's first clubhouse. It's the one on the right. We can see the white columns there. At first, the club had met for many years at Eagle Hall, which was at the corner of 2nd and Virginia Streets, but they hoped to construct a new building. And a lot of prominent local businessmen were donating them money to their building fund, including Senators Francis G. Newlands and George Nixon. But ultimately, they decided to purchase the clubhouse of the Nevada Club, which is what that little building is there. We're looking actually north across the Truckee River toward First Street. And in the back, you can see the Baptist Church spire. Was behind that. They actually have the Reno Wheelman's Club is immediately behind their building. So it was called Chestnut Street at the time. That's what Arlington was Chestnut, north of the river on First Street. And then, of course, the next phase was what we're more familiar with, which is the 20th Century Club building at 335 West First Street, which was erected in 1925, and that building's still here. So this is a prominent Reno architect, Fred Shadler, who designed the building and drew the design from the Prairie School, which had strong horizontal lines and an addition of classical elements, such as these arched windows. It's just a beautiful little building. You can kind of show what it looks like today. It's this little one-story building that is so much smaller than everything around it. If you want to go to the next slide so you can see what it looks like today. And it's on the western limits of the downtown core. So things around it have gotten much taller than at the time when it was constructed. You can see Arlington Tower over there on the right, and on the left, a more mid-century apartment building.
Now that the Nevada Equal Franchise Society is around, Ann Martin immediately joins the organization. And she becomes its president in February 1912. So it's only been around a year. She becomes president when Margaret Stanislawski, who was the previous president, resigned and moved to California. Florence Humphrey Church served as the vice president of the Nevada Equal Franchise Society during Ann Martin's tenure as president. And as president, Martin was extremely organized, and she expanded the organization in new directions. At her behest, the Reno headquarters relocated from the Cheney building, which is no longer around, to larger offices at the Washoe County Bank building at 2nd and Virginia Street, pictured here. And from these headquarters, she orchestrated the formation of those various county leagues that we mentioned earlier, which were just absolutely instrumental in winning state suffrage. This is one of the oldest commercial buildings in the downtown area. The two-story Italianate style building was designed by architect John S. Sturgeon to house the Fraternal Order on the 2nd floor, and the Reno Savings Bank and Sanders and Company furniture store on the ground floor. The Oddfellows celebrated the laying of the cornerstone on August 30th, 1876, and the bank opened for business in January 1877. So just giving you a little bit of background for the building. And in other parts of Reno, we're also seeing a lot of suffrage activity. So in May 1912, with the assistance of the university president, Joseph Stubbs, and in spite of the opposition of university regent, Charles Henderson, a chapter of the National College Equal Suffrage League was established at the University of Nevada in Reno after a visit to campus from Charlotte Whitney, who was a delegate from its national organization. It was led, well, the chapter at the University of Nevada was led by Clara Smith. The group had monthly meetings. They were provided assistance by Ann Martin, and they sent delegates to the county session. And this just shows you what that building looks like today, the Washoe County Bank building. So over the years, it's been occupied by various other tenants, including the Ramos Drug Store and Edison's Jewelers. And in 1982, a major remodel completely changed the appearance of the building, adding modern aluminum frame storefront windows, a large clock tower capped, most notably this large clock tower that's capped with the French style mansard roof. We also see men forming their own pro-suffrage organizations during this time, including the Men's League for Women's Suffrage in Nevada. And this happened when James Laidlaw, a New York banker who served as national chairman for the Men's League for Women's Suffrage, visited Nevada in 1914. And he worked with Renoite and Judge William P. Seeds to form a state league. George H. Taylor hosted the league's inaugural meeting at his home in Reno. Taylor's home, which was located at 235 South Virginia Street, no longer stands. It's now the site of the courthouse parking lot between Virginia and Sierra Streets. But you can see pictured here is Judge Seed's home on Flint Street, which is still standing.
There's really not much at all in this picture that still stands, but this is a really wonderful picture for the suffrage movement because of the banner. And by the time the suffrage amendment came before the 1913 legislative session, Nevada was surrounded by other states that had given women the right to vote. And so that fact led many to refer to Nevada as the black spot on the map. And so this image of Nevada as the black spot on the map, you can see here with, in that banner, in the West, surrounded by these white states, and there's, Nevada in the middle that hasn't given women the right to vote yet. So Governor Tasker Oddie supported the suffrage movement, which of course passed overwhelmingly from the legislature, and then, in 1914. So, but to the right of this banner in the picture would be that Washoe County Bank building. And if you're looking south here on Virginia Street, so down at the foot, on the right, you can see the Riverside Hotel that was sort of the short-lived Riverside Hotel there that ended up burning before the current one was constructed. And to the left with the columns at the end of the street there was the original post office building on the later Mapes site that was torn down when they built the new post office, the downtown post office, across on the south bank of the river. So what we're looking at over on the left side, we don't really have anything really existing much anymore. A couple things on the right are actually historic. And I think our next photo, is sort of the same view. Oh, there's actually first a little more close up of that black spot on the map image, because it really was on postcards and on different booklets. And was sort of considered to be, shameful, right? It was really just a terrible thing that, why can't Nevada get its act together? And so I just love that we see that image all over the place. But here is that site today of looking south for the existing Riverside Hotel, right? Riverside Artist Lofts. And on the very right there, you can see the Washoe County Bank building where Ann Martin had her offices. And just recently, last year, the Nevada Votes for Women, the National Votes for Women Trail, in conjunction with that, have had a marker placed at that building to recognize its significance to the suffrage movement in Nevada. And so that's actually a plaque that's there on the sidewalk.
So The suffrage amendment has passed in 1911, the legislative session. It passed the 1913 legislative session. And now we're kind of in this final push. But it wasn't without its challenges. Not all women supported the suffrage cause. And Nevada's anti-suffrage movement really starts to organize after the legislature passes the suffrage amendment in 1913. They realize that it's getting serious, it's going to go to the electorate. They probably thought, you know, it wasn't going to pass the second time because it never had before. And suddenly they realize that they need to start discouraging voters to approve it. So on May 21st, 1914, not 6 months before the upcoming election, the Nevada Association of Women Opposed to Equal Suffrage was founded in Reno at the grand home of Ada Finlayson Rhee on Reno's fashionable Court Street. Nevada's branch was centered in Reno among members of the social elite, a group that in addition to Lee included Jane Isabel French Fletcher, Clara Mabel Field Statmuller, and Emily Adams, who was the wife of former Nevada Governor Jewett Adams. Lee's lavish house, which is pictured here, was a frequent meeting place. And this is actually just east of the Hawkins house on Court Street, which this is the house today, or, you know, is not the house today. So in 1956, the house was purchased by the Catholic Diocese of Reno for use as a Dominican Brothers monastery. And it was later sold to a developer who tore it down in 1964 to make way for Court Towers, a 13-story condominium project that was obviously never constructed. And it has remained this vacant lot ever since, from that grand, gorgeous Richardsonian Romanesque house. I mean, that's a style we barely even see in Reno, to this empty lot. But we do have one surviving property that we know of that's associated with the anti-suffrage movement, and it is this home on Ridge Street. So this is only about a block south of the Lee home, or the site of the Lee home, also in the Newlands Historic District. And this served as the headquarters of the Nevada Association of Women Opposed to Equal Suffrage.
We just wanted to quickly show an image of another very prominent anti-suffrage character in Reno at the time, who was, of course, one of Reno's most well-known names, George Wingfield. And he also had a mansion on Court Street that was just down the street from that house that we just showed you, the Lee House, which is also no longer standing. And so it's actually the soon-to-be site of a very tall hotel, apparently. But he was very opposed to the women's vote. He was in favor of liquor and gaming interests, and often those things kind of coincided. But he was often called the state's best-known suffrage opponent. Another thing that we wanted to show you was this wonderful photo of a parade float that we often see for a suffrage parade. Throughout 1914, Nevada suffragists and their allies presented a very well-coordinated campaign with all sorts of representatives and volunteers really pouring into Nevada up until the election to organize and speak. Jane Addams spoke for suffrage at Reno's Majestic Theater, which was again on the same block where the Mapes would later be. And suffrage supporters constructed this very striking float that won second prize at a carnival parade in Reno on July 12, 1914, drawn by 4 white horses that were draped in flowers and banners reading, "Don't keep your women out," which you can see very faintly on the horse's banner. And the float was adorned with more than 500 yellow chrysanthemums. Riding on top were more than a dozen young women in Grecian-inspired costumes, with several wearing banners to represent states where women already had the right to vote. And at the reins was F.O. Norton, who was the husband of Reno suffragist Lena Norton. And of course, our courthouse still stands today. It's one of our just beautiful Frederick de Longchamp's buildings. It had been constructed in 1911 and is listed on historic registers, including the city of Reno's historic register. And so one of these efforts that I think this initiative can help make is try to nominate more properties with this kind of relevance to the city of Reno's historic register, which can offer actually the most protections for a historic property. Now, also Ann Martin, of course, largely credited with the organized and effective campaigning in Nevada's rural counties. At the time, there were 23,000 voters in Nevada, and more than half of those resided in the rural counties. So Martin is just known as being the mastermind of the rural Nevada campaign to secure support for suffrage in the rural counties, and traveled throughout the state in her little Model T, and she and her colleagues rented these Model Ts for their statewide campaign when it was not easy to get around the state by vehicle. And anti-suffrage advocates also remained active in 1914. They gathered at the Majestic Theater to hear representatives opposed to equal suffrage speak. But the exhaustive efforts, of course, of this suffrage movement paid off. And the all-male electorate, obviously approved the Nevada constitutional amendment to allow Nevada women to vote. And what is very interesting is that statewide, the amendment passed by a 20% margin. 10,000, these are how low the numbers were because there weren't a lot of people in Nevada. 10,936 votes in favor and 7,258 opposing votes. The measure passed in 12 of the 16 counties. And as Ann Martin had predicted, the most populous counties, so the most kind of urban counties, Eureka, Ormsby, Story, and Washoe, all voted against it. But despite the fact that Reno citizens voted against it, there was a whole big crowd of about 200 people who gathered on Virginia Street near the headquarters of the Nevada Equal Franchise Society to celebrate.
So just for really quick reference, we have two maps of properties in Reno that we've identified so far that are associated with suffrage and women's rights history. This map shows the resources that we have lost. These properties were mostly the homes of Reno suffragists like Jeannie Weir, Emma Mack, Margaret Stanislawski's house no longer stands. And these were all, residential homes that were located in the oldest parts of Reno, which also happen to be the most redeveloped areas downtown and near the university. So unfortunately, at least with the properties that we know of so far, hopefully more will be discovered, more are gone than still exist. And so these are the properties that are still standing. So you can see, there weren't a ton before, but it really shrinks down. And the hope is that these that do exist and retain physical integrity to the suffrage period, so you could still, recognize them. Someone from the suffrage period would be able to walk down the street and recognize the building, right? That's kind of like the test for integrity. Those that do retain integrity, we're hoping will eventually be nominated for listing in the National Register of Historic Places for its association with this history. And the beauty of our property list so far is it is not final, it's not exhaustive, and we expect that researchers will continue to identify significant places that are associated with the themes of suffrage and women's rights, both in Reno and throughout Nevada. And they'll be able to use our document as a guide for determining whether those properties would be eligible for the National Register under those themes. We did want to show you a couple of websites that have been really invaluable resources for us. Obviously we didn't provide in-depth biographies of a lot of the women that we mentioned today. But if you are interested in learning more, the Nevada Women's History Project website is a fantastic resource. They have hundreds of biographies of women, influential, important, significant women throughout the state. And also the Nevada Women's Suffrage Centennial website. It offers suffragist biographies. And I believe there is also a timeline on this website that's really Really fantastic. A lot of hard work and good research went into both of these websites, and we highly recommend that you check them out if you would like to learn more.
One of the other aspects of this context that we're excited about is the compilation of bibliography. And there have been some terrific bibliographies. There is a bibliography of Nevada women's history that has recently been updated, and that is available online as well, which is a very huge resource for us. But we will have our own bibliography in this context. And the context, when it is completed and vetted and returned and approved, will be on this website, which is the website for Nevada's State Historic Preservation Office. And we just wanted to let people know about the really extraordinary amount of research and resources that are available on this website. It's just terrific. And we want to spread the word about it because there are lots of different types of research documents that are available here. There are multiple documentation forums, which are nominations that cover a range of associated properties and kind of tells the story of all of them together, in addition to individual National Register nomination forms, which are available on this website through another page that has a map where you can kind of click on Nevada map and pull up what was on the National Register there, and then actually download those forms. But some of the subjects, range from agriculture on the Carson River to fire stations of Nevada, to the African-American civil rights experience in Nevada from 1900 to 1979, which was the last context to be written for the state. And I did a little bit of work on that one. So this just continues to be a place where there is more and more information that historians and anyone can go to and try to access information that others have compiled and interpreted and written about the history of our state. So I think that brings us to the end of our formal presentation, and we're happy to take any questions from anyone, but it's just been such a pleasure to be here and kind of share our work. We are, as we said, in the final push of this, so we actually will be turning in the final draft toward the end of November, which gives us just about a month or so, and there's just so much more that we want to do, but we have to kind of go with the understanding that this is not exhaustive. It's really just trying to accomplish as much as it can to really push this documentation forward and assist people in the future to do even more work.
Thank you, Alicia and ZoAnn. It was wonderful, and I've been really waiting to hear this report and this program. So I actually knew they've been working on it for a while. I'm like, when is it going to be done? When's it going to be done? I want to present this with heart. So I appreciate both of you ladies giving this wonderful program. So we do have some questions. So the first question is, what were the requirements to be a member of the 20th Century Club? Was it only a women's only group? Do you know that answer?
I don't think I know that answer. Do you, ZoAnn? I mean, I believe that it was, I believe that it was a women's group, but there may be people in the audience who actually know. But certainly we know that there were a lot of their meetings that were attended by both men and women, because we've seen the documentation.
Exactly. That's
So, but as far as
I think so.
Yeah, I mean,
if there was an explicit women only rule, or if it was just implied that it was a women's club.
Mm-hmm. We can imagine kind of with gender roles.
Right,
and
they
may have been divided in that way. What a great question. Yeah.
Yeah, no, and I was thinking about that too. It's like, I know that they had many subcommittees, literary and things, and I know men and women could both attend that. So I didn't know the answer as well. So, okay, the next question is, it sounds like with women's issues, Nevada was relatively progressive historically, at least in some ways. How do we compare to other states at the time?
Well, I mean, it really seemed to vary depending upon the area. Like we said, I think that in terms of things like divorce and property rights seem to be a little more progressive in the late 19th century, maybe, than others. And kind of keeping Nevada's history in mind and realizing that, from an early point, before it was banned and then later reinstated, gambling was very accepted and was legal early on. Prostitution, of course, legal for a very long time, even within Reno and Las Vegas city limits. right through World War II. But in many, in other ways, quite conservative, and as ZoAnn was talking about, especially in later years, it seems not quite jumping on some of the more progressive issues that were benefiting women and children the way that other states were. So would you say, ZoAnn, kind of a mixed bag, really, as far as progressive?
I mean, even comparing with other states, when you look at those early divorce laws, I mean, our first divorce laws came from Utah Territory. And those were relatively lax, compared to the Eastern United States. And then we changed them a little bit to more closely align with California's divorce laws, which liberalized them even more. So we were taking cues from the states around us, except maybe not so much with suffrage, because you look at states, I know like Wyoming comes to mind.
Right.
When Wyoming became a state, they gave the vote to everybody. And I know there are other Western states, maybe Oregon did the same thing. That didn't happen with Nevada, but we did become a state like 20 years before these other states. So that may have had something to do with it.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. I have another question. Did I hear that a woman living in the US in 1990 would lose their citizenship by marrying a non-citizen? And I've never heard of that either. So.
Oh, in 1919?
Yeah.
Yeah, ZoAnn, you were talking about that. They'd lose their citizenship by marrying a non-citizen. Yes. I think that was actually.
I think so, yeah. I mean, they lost the right to vote, so.
Do you know when that changed at all? Was that a little bit later? You were saying in like 24 that more women had the right to vote. Did that change by then, or is that just something later on that just kind of gets adapted or changed with the laws? Do you know?
I'm not sure.
Yeah, I don't think
I'm sorry to put you on the spot. I was curious.
I mean, I kind of feel like with the way the laws went, as far as like women becoming less defined by who they're married to,
right.
We don't really see that happen until the 50s. But we would have to look into it, just like thinking about the general theme when, you didn't have to be Mrs. somebody anymore, and you could kind of separate your own identity from that of your husband.
We spend a lot of time in our research, actually, when we're looking at historical newspapers, and women are only identified by the name of their husband, Mrs. John, whatever. And then we just have to go to all of our resources to find out what were these women's names, because their names aren't given. And we want to provide the woman's name, when we can, which is where all of these biographies on the Nevada Women's History Project sites and the Suffrage Centennial site have been so helpful, because sometimes that is very difficult information to have, unless you all go all the way back to census records, and such, because they're used that way. So yeah, I mean, I think there's sort of the convergence there of these, of kind of the, the curvature laws, that have to do with women getting their identity and their rights through their husband, but then also the intersection with those citizenship laws, which had to do with your racial and ethnic background, through the early 20th century.
Okay.
For sure.
Yeah, and you're right, it is difficult. I mean, you have to dig around with Ancestry and newspapers and hope you start seeing references. Now, what I think is interesting, we have the AAUW University Women's Collection, and we have their early membership cards from the early 20s, and women actually list their name, but some, of course, then list the husband's name, and it's like, who are you? So no, I understand. Come on. Okay, there's another question. Can a property be put on the National Register after it's been demolished? I would say probably no, but would that be a marker then? Is that a distinction?
It can't be placed on the National Register if it doesn't exist. But it could possibly be like a place for a commemorative marker if there's a local or state program to do so.
Okay. All right.
And some of the sites that are marked on the National Votes for Women Trail, and even in the state of Nevada, are marking sites, and not buildings, because that also tells the story, and so it's often very important to mark those, even if the building is gone.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's see. NEFF sent a Nevada banner to Anne Martin in London, and she carried it in a parade. That's interesting.
Anne Martin had a great
but
English part of her life. Yeah,
she did. Yeah,
that's
yeah.
great.
And didn't she even get arrested and go to jail and things of that nature
She
too?
learned a lot of tactics.
Okay, there's another question. Yes. Let's see. Alicia indicated that Reno Historic Register gives more protection than the national. What protection would that be?
Well, yes, and so, you know, local historic registers vary in what their provisions are, but at least in Reno and in many other, you know, other places in the state, being listed on the local register often ensures that if any changes are going to be made to the exterior of the building, or the owner wants to make any changes, whether it's replacing windows or, you know, sometimes it's even including paint, depending on what was sort of recognized as being the historic nature of the building. You have to go through a process. You have to go through a public hearing and get a certificate of appropriateness from the entity. Here in Reno, it's the Historical Resources Commission that is, you know, essentially in charge of reviewing those types of changes to ensure that they don't take away from the integrity of the building. And so that is something that happens on the local level. Listing in the National Register is most of the time purely honorary. There are certain cases where eligibility to the National Register or being listed in the National Register can kick off some processes that can attempt at the very least to document what the building is, if the building is threatened through some sort of activity or action, a process called Section 106, and there's some other processes too. But you know, even in Reno, being listed cannot prevent a building from being demolished if an owner of a building wants to demolish it, but it is a way to offer more protections to the historical integrity, usually of its exterior, which is what, you know, the majority of people will see. That about right, ZoAnn? You're a historic preservation expert.
There's another question, or actually an idea or suggestion. The Lone Mountain Cemetery has markers on many historic grave sites. It would be wonderful to have markers at Mountain View Cemetery for like Anne Martin, Jeannie Weir, and some of the early suffrage supporters, you know, added, you know, maybe that's just a site that could be on Reno Historical of, you know, places to visit, you know, where maybe these last places where they are. I do have a question. So I know you're still in you're in edit 2, getting closer for your report, but can you tell us how many women and buildings you've kind of listed with your report that you've are submitting with SHPO, or do you have kind of a final figure or an idea? I was just kind of curious.
How many are on our property list, I wonder? Yeah, I mean, as far as the number of women, they're so, you know, they're throughout the entire narrative. I'm sure there are probably hundreds there, but I'm thinking about the properties that we've identified. Would you say a couple dozen, ZoAnn, throughout the state?
I think there are more.
Okay.
Hold on.
Not understanding, but we've been, you know, putting some in, and we're trying to identify, you know, mostly the ones that still exist. And every once in a while we hear someone, you know, say like, you know, like we were just learning Eva Adams, her house, you know, is still here in Reno. And so we, you know, scramble and find it, and then we can, you know, document that and get it on the list. So even if there's a lot known about them. How many did you see, ZoAnn?
Yeah, we have 66.
Okay.
That are still standing.
Nice.
And 37 that we know have been demolished.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Maybe some people aren't aware of, but can you talk a little bit about some of the reasons why women and men supported anti-suffrage? What were some of the main points that you saw in promotional material, or some of the things you read in the paper?
Politics were not the realm of women. I feel like that that's kind of an argument, like a theme that we see. You know, people are threatened that once women get, you know, the vote, that they'll no longer be effective wives and mothers. They won't be effective in the house anymore because they'll be so wrapped up in politics all of a sudden. And that's something we see even in the 70s with the Equal Rights Amendment. I mean, the main argument was that if we say that women and men are equal under the law, it's going to somehow endanger like women's roles as wives and mothers and caretakers.
And force them to do everything that men do, you know, without
Right,
distinction,
exactly.
right?
Yeah, with no special provisions or protections that we otherwise might enjoy.
Sort of thrown out there, you know, as kind of the specter was, well, you'll have to serve in the military, you know, in combat, right? You'll have to do all those things. So, but yeah, it seemed like a lot of protectiveness was the, especially in the early years with the anti-suffrage movement, was sort of protecting women, keeping them from that sort of distasteful, you know, more sort of polluted atmosphere of politics. And women would say, yes, you know, my place is in this home, and training citizens, like raising good male citizens would be the women's role in politics. And so they would say like that is just as important as participating in the vote yourself. So we see that kind of thing a lot.
Okay.
And then there were just people like George Wingfield
Now,
who didn't want women voting because then they might, you know, enact prohibition, right? They might, you know, they might want to enact types of legislation that would go against his business interests. And I think that was his primary reason for being one of the anti-suffrage activists.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's why you see that in Washoe County, where you've got these businessmen are worrying about those kind of things, how it will impact their businesses as well. So, well, ladies, I don't see any other questions, but I just wanted to say thank you so much for being our speakers today, and it was wonderful. So I'm looking forward to being able to see your final report when it's done, and I will send it back to Samantha, and thank you again.
Thank you
so much.
Thank you all for joining us tonight. Thank you, Alicia Barber, ZoAnn Campana, Carol Coleman, Susan Mullen, and Sherry Hayes-Sorn with the Historic Reno Preservation Society. Thank you, John, our Washoe County Library Tech Wizard, for making this event possible tonight. Don't forget to sign up for the next live Historic Reno Preservation Society event on Tuesday, November 9th at 5:30. The topic will be Reno's Hebrew Cemetery and Jews in Northern Nevada, presented by Sharon Honig-Bear. Be sure to sign up at events.washoecountylibrary.us. See you next time.